To this Libraries Connected webinar on social cohesion. My name is Becky Scott and I'm the project manager for workforce development at Libraries Connected, and I will be your sort of host for today. So just a few housekeeping things before I introduce our speaker. So first of all, we are going to record this webinar. So we will record the bit where our speaker is speaking, but we'll stop the recording for the Q&A because this topic may invite interesting questions, and so I want people to feel free to be able to ask those questions. So we'll just record the presentation and we'll share that obviously afterwards, and also the slides. While Jake is speaking, I'd ask you to keep yourself on mute so that he can focus and concentrate, but please do maybe make a note of your questions or pop them in the chat, and then we'll invite you to kind of ask those during the Q&A. I think that is everything I needed to remember, so I will now introduce our speaker. So welcome to Jake Puddle, Senior Researcher at British Future. Jake, over to you, and as I say, do pop your questions in the chat as they arise.
Thank you, Becky, and it's great to see you all here today. I'm just going to share my screen before we get going, so do bear with me. I hope everyone can see that okay. So yeah, my name's Jake Puddle. I'm a senior researcher for the independent think tank and charity British Future. We specialise in creating a more confident and welcoming country that feels inclusive and fair to all by trying to understand sort of the lay of the land public attitudes on these divisive topics in our current political landscape around things like immigration, integration, race and identity. And today I'm going to be sharing with you some of the key findings from some recent national research that we've been carrying out on behalf of a new independent commission on community and cohesion. Through this research, we've really sought to get a kind of snapshot on the state of unity and division in the UK, and to understand how we can avoid becoming a more polarized society, given, you know, many of the news headlines I'm sure you've seen over the recent couple of years, and particularly actually in the recent weeks. And yeah, over the next year or so, this new independent commission, which is being chaired by Sir Sajid Javid and John Cruddas, will be leading a new national conversation on some of the solutions on how we move forward towards a society where people can live well together over the long term. I'll make sure to share some information about the work of the Commission at the end of this presentation. But our think tank British Future, in partnership with another charity called Belong, the Cohesion and Integration Network, conducted this research to give the Commission some starting points as they begin their work, a bit of an evidence base to get going. So what did our research involve? Well, we sought to paint an authoritative picture on the state of community cohesion and community strength in the UK through two kind of separate strands of research. So firstly, we had lots of conversations with the public. So we held focus groups around every nation of the UK, including in a number of areas that had seen kind of community fallouts, rioting and disorder previously in 2024 during that really nasty wave. And we also had a quite robust and extensive opinion poll that we put out to the public as well, which reached 2,250 odd UK adults. So that sought to map out public attitudes. And then alongside this, we also sought to consult stakeholders and organisations who are doing work to engage communities and bring people from different backgrounds together. So this involved 15 stakeholder and expert roundtable discussions in every region and nation of the UK. And we also had a very large call for evidence open, in which I believe Becky and colleagues actually contributed a submission on the great work that libraries have been doing in this space.
I'll credit James Gray for the work on that, because it definitely wasn't me. So James's excellent work.
Big thank you to James for submitting. But it was really helpful for us to understand kind of current good practice and to make sure we weren't reinventing the wheel, but rather we're pointing to things that could be better resourced and scaled up. So I'll go through the full findings in more detail on the following slides and over the next 30 to 35 minutes. But here is essentially what we captured in a nutshell over our research. What we found is that Britain is facing a really worrying time, where cohesion really needs to be taken more seriously at the risk of further outbreaks of violence. And actually, we released our report on our findings in July, saying that there is a risk of further unrest without more government action and funding to support work on cohesion. And very sadly, the protests and the tensions in Epping kicked off only, I think, 2 days later. So it felt quite bad to be sort of the naysayer of difficult times, but I suppose goes to show that these flashpoints aren't coming out of nowhere, but rather through kind of long-term bubbling tensions. And in any case, actually, the absence of rioting on our streets should not be the bellwether of cohesion. But what we found in our research is a cocktail of pressures and challenges that are exacerbating polarization and eroding social cohesion across our society. And these key factors are public concerns about asylum and immigration, which of course have been very much in the news, in the headlines over the last couple of weeks. Deepening economic pessimism and widespread concerns about public services, inequality, and the cost of living. A changing kind of information landscape and environment where social media can rapidly lead to a rise in tensions and spread of mis and disinformation. And also a crisis in public trust in politicians and democratic structures, where people feel that their voices are simply not being heard and their views and kind of core priority needs are not being addressed by sort of politics as usual. So there are a lot of difficult things, difficult issues that we need to contend with and that the Independent Commission will be getting its teeth into over the next few months. But I don't want to frame this as entirely negative. And I do also want to point out that we found some useful foundations on which to build through our research. Namely, most people have quite strong positive views about relationships between people of different backgrounds in their immediate neighbourhood. So their kind of hyper-local experience differs very much from their attitudes towards the nation and towards sort of their online interactions. But at the same time, this view doesn't extend to everyone. And there are some areas that where people feel relations are more cohesive and other areas that are more deprived or that have higher levels of population churn, people moving in and out, experience more difficulties. So that's kind of the summary, but I will kind of get into more of our findings in detail now over the rest of the presentation. So to start with some of our positive findings, our good news first. As I say, at a hyper-local level, our polling actually finds that people hold largely positive views on community relations in the UK. So when we ask people if their local area is a place where people of different backgrounds get on well together, 7 in 10 people agree. And as you can see, it's only about 1 in 10 people say that sort of local community relations are bad. Our focus groups indicate that when people are talking about their local area, what they mean by this is kind of their immediate neighbourhood, their street, or their estate. So they're talking about the people, basically their neighbours that they interact with on a kind of day-to-day level. And we heard really positive stories, for example, particularly about the result of the COVID pandemic and how this had knitted new neighbourly connections that had kind of outlasted the kind of COVID era. People were still keeping in touch with each other on WhatsApp groups, saying hello to each other over garden fences. And that, yeah, that time around 2020, 2021 had brought communities a little bit closer together as people had spent more time conversing with their neighbours. What we also find is that a similar proportion of the public, so about 7 in 10, report having opportunities for social contact with others who are from a different background to themselves. Then about 1 in 4 rarely have such opportunities, and 5% just report never meeting people from a different background to themselves. And across our research, those respondents who took part in our survey that reported having these opportunities to meet and mix with others, then actually held much more positive and confident views about the state of cohesion, both locally and nationally. So they were more confident about the diversity of our society and the resilience of our society to change as well. And it's not just our research that finds this as well. There's a really long track record and kind of evidence base of research on what's called social contact theory that stretches back decades, which shows that the more people from different backgrounds, what we call in-groups and out-groups, meet and mix, the more they build up empathy and trust and break down kind of prejudices and stereotypes. So this is quite a positive foundation on which to build, and I think probably fares comparatively better in the UK to other sort of, for example, continental European countries in terms of the levels of social contact that we're having with people from other walks of life on a daily basis. At the same time, though, it's probably worth caveating this finding and to point out that in both this graph and the graph on the previous slide, attitudes do vary from place to place. So this is a national average, but you know, there are regional and local differences. In some of the focus groups we were carrying out in a range of different areas around the UK, we heard more mixed reflections on how things were going on. people tended to report lower levels of community participation and sort of lower confidence in cohesion in more deprived areas, particularly where there were kind of lower quality community spaces for people to come together. This was also true in areas with higher population churn, for example, kind of some urban centres where high populations of renters were moving in and out without laying roots in their community. And also it could be a factor in areas that had stronger concerns around crime because people were more likely to stay at home and felt a little bit more wary about going out to meet others in the local community. But there are definitely some strong foundations about people's local experience that can strengthen, I think, national views on cohesion and can be a useful kind of lever to open debates about cohesion and community relations in our society. One of our most interesting questions that we also asked the public, excuse me, was what brings us together across our differences in the UK? And I touched on this in people's local experience of their kind of immediate neighbourhood. But interestingly, what came out on top was our capacity to come together in times of crisis. So people talk about Britain having a blitz spirit, but that really actually came through both in our polling and our focus groups. So we heard this a lot with regard to kind of neighbourhood mutual aid groups, some of which had outlasted the pandemic, as I say. But it wasn't just about people's experience over COVID. We also heard, for example, in areas that had experienced riots, about the impact of community cleanups that followed some of the unrest and the chaos in the streets, where faith groups and neighbourhood community groups came together the next day to support those who were sort of targeted and victimised by the violence and to clean up and tidy up their communities. So there is a sense that people do come together when they need to in the UK. Also, there were some other interesting kind of events, moments, and cultural institutions that do successfully bring us together. These include kind of major sporting events, and it's worth noting that the UK will be hosting the Euros soon as well, so there's some potential here. And there are also important shared traditions, things like Remembrance Day and kind of major anniversaries as well that were felt to bring people together. And I know, of course, libraries play an important role in kind of marking and celebrating some of these anniversaries and historic events as well. But we do also have, crucially, a number of kind of interconnected pressures that are creating ongoing vulnerability to polarisation in the UK, and that, if left unaddressed, could leave us at risk of future unrest and sort of further rioting if we do not have a kind of more strategic national response to build up resilience to this sort of division. It's these sorts of factors that make it really important that we maintain a long-term focus on improving cohesion and community strength, because what we often find through our work at British Future is that when things kick off, you know, you get a Tommy Robinson march or you get a riot, the government might speak about cohesion momentarily, but it tends to drop off their agenda quite fast. So what we're saying is you need to have a long-term, ongoing approach to cohesion to avoid the bubbling up of some of these long-term and interconnected pressures. But I'll get into these now. Firstly, we found consistently strong and polarised views on the issue of asylum in all of our focus groups around the UK. And when we asked people who took part in our opinion poll to rank issues that were kind of negatively impacting cohesion in their local area, then divides over asylum seekers and refugees comes out as the top issue impacting people's views on cohesion locally and actually also nationally as well. Concerns about channel crossings often centred on perceptions of kind of community safety, the validity of people's claims for asylum, and a sense of frustration with recent governments of different parties, both Conservative and Labour, over a visible lack of control at the border. However, what we found in our focus groups was that the most frequent issue raised was of a perceived competition for resources. So this feeling that people seeking asylum and refugees were getting somehow preferential treatment, being put up in five-star hotels or being given free phones. Declining public services and standards of living were leading to a kind of anger that was being scapegoated towards people seeking asylum. And often these narratives were sadly being kind of twisted and polarized through online misinformation that was sort of exaggerating the level of support that people seeking asylum were receiving. And actually, it is worth acknowledging that while people were, you know, very angry and there were deep frustrations and divisions about the asylum system, people did also recognise in our focus groups that the debate was needlessly being, I guess, sort of polarised to an extra degree by the tone and tenor of online debate. Secondly, on our kind of list of pressures, we found consistent and strong feelings of economic pessimism in our discussions, in our focus groups. And this backs up findings from other similar research studies over the last year or so on cohesion, for example, by the charity Hope Not Hate, which many of you might have come across. So the cost of living, inequality, and the perceived decline of some areas is creating really deep frustration at policymakers, councils, and often local minority groups. And participants across the political spectrum, left-wing and right-wing, reported feeling that their needs were not being met and their voices were not being heard, particularly regarding sort of failures to deliver public services, such as the NHS and policing, but also the cost of living crisis, the housing crisis, and sort of regional disparities between London and the rest of the UK contributed to a widely held sense of frustration. That there was a deep sense of anxiety about the impact that this was having on communities and people's lives. So you can see that in some of the quotes on the slide here. For example, one person, this goes back to that kind of competition for resources point on the previous slide, but one person is saying, my mother-in-law has just gone into a care home and we have to pay thousands of pounds a month. She's worked all her life. She doesn't get the heating allowance now. These are all little things that have been taken away. The TV license too. I think the unskilled workers coming in, the boats, it's also negative. You see all these people coming in, and they're getting 3 hot meals a day and a hotel. And you can see here that kind of interconnection between misinformation about asylum seekers and some of the treatment that they're getting, and also the use of hotels, and how that's then leading to a scapegoating of minority groups, really due to people's economic pessimism and some of the struggles that they're going through with the cost of living crisis. What we also found in our polling is that many people in our survey reported having neither the money nor the time to take part in community life in the way that they had done prior to the pandemic as well. So as well as, creating these pressures and these sort of stresses on community relations, it was the cost of living crisis was also restricting people's ability to go out and meet and mix with others from different backgrounds. So it was contributing to polarization in kind of different directions at the same time. Thirdly, we found a stark theme of declining political trust. And the issues flagged before in my previous slides about perceived national decline, the rising cost of living, and divisive debates about the asylum system meant that many in our focus groups just felt the government was failing to deliver change and to listen to people's concerns. We heard strong views about politicians, and in some cases local councillors also, that had been embroiled in local scandals, for example. And incidents such as the COVID-19 Partygate, and more recently kind of Labour's Ticketgate that you might remember, and council corruption allegations, these all emerged quite strongly as sort of, I suppose, setting politicians up as seeming quite sneaky and quite self-serving. So participants just seemed very fed up with politics as usual, and very, I suppose, disenfranchised with the potential for politics to deliver meaningful change in their lives. All of these together led to what many of our participants described in varying kind of words as a kind of unalignment with mainstream political parties, particularly the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. And this anger and this disillusionment with those two, governing parties was also driving an openness towards, in some cases, populism, populist parties that people hadn't voted for before. And that's probably reflected in some of the recent opinion polls if people have been following those as well. And then lastly, I've touched on this already, but there was a strong concern about online polarization. So social media platforms were seen as lacking regulation by people across the political spectrum, actually, who noted having seen rising levels of hatred and misinformation on their timelines and their social media feeds. And people in our focus groups were really keen to see healthier online spaces with less racism and just more space for communities to actually come together around positive things rather than being fed a kind of timeline of negative clickbait and negative opinions all the time. They were unsure how the government could actually realistically drive this kind of change, given that social media companies are these big international corporations, but it was something on which people across the political spectrum felt very strongly about. And so it will, I'm sure, be a priority of the Independent Commission as they take forward their work. So these perspectives about cohesion and community beyond people's immediate neighbourhoods are considerably more pessimistic and anxious, as you can see. And clearly there's an urgent need to address these risk factors if we're to avoid a kind of future that is, I suppose, a political landscape where violence and rioting and disorder are becoming more frequent occurrences. How can we make progress on this, and where do we kind of start from? Well, as you might have seen at the beginning of the presentation, our research also conducted a mass engagement exercise with experts and organizations and stakeholders working in these issues to try and understand a little bit about what's going well, where are the gaps, and what are some of the priorities for change. And in the second half of this presentation, I'll quickly whiz through some of the key insights that came out of this research. So while much of the change we need lies with national governments, there is also an awful lot that local institutions and community anchor organisations, like libraries, for example, can do to address social polarisation. A few key points here on the slide. Firstly, our research highlights a rich variety of case studies where organisations have used their work to create opportunities for social contact, that social mixing that I mentioned at the beginning that helps to kind of break down prejudice and build trust. These sorts of initiatives ranged from organising local litter picks from people of different backgrounds through to holding community exhibitions to platform people's stories and histories, or it could be arts clubs or events that bring people together around kind of shared hobbies as well. Importantly, these activities consciously sought to engage and attract and then bring together people across different backgrounds through finding, I suppose, those sort of commonalities between people of different cultures or ages or political perspectives, things like food or football that people hold in common and are likely to come together around an event, a festival, or a kind of local project. These opportunities for social contact can be really, really important as an anecdote for division. And as I mentioned in our polling, people who reported having more contact with people of different walks of life then ended up being more confident about issues of immigration, diversity, and cohesion. So we feel there's a really important starting point here of just making sure that all institutions across our society that are working in communities are looking at the levers that they can pull to bring their local residents together across lines of difference. Secondly, we found that local leadership is key to ensure that social cohesion is taken seriously and not neglected, as I say, over the long term, as it so often is, particularly at a national government level. Local councils have a really important role here in coming up with things like local social cohesion plans, which I think might become a new requirement under changes in government policy to be announced soon. But it also goes beyond local councils to encompass civil society and other major kind of community organisations as well. Our best examples of organisations that were being responsive to cohesion tensions highlighted that you need to reassure communities rapidly during points of tension to make sure particularly those who are victimised and targeted feel like local institutions have their back and are standing in unity with them. And also it's important that while we talk about legitimate concerns, the need to have honest and open debates about immigration, institutions across society, both nationally and locally, also call out and acknowledge where there is hateful racism taking place in local areas as well, and that there are broad coalitions vocally standing up against hateful extremism on our streets. Thirdly, what we found from our kind of case studies of good practice, our stakeholder research, was the importance of telling positive stories about our diverse and cohesive society. We were actually quite shocked by how many organisations were doing really good work to bring communities together, but then they so often lacked the confidence to shout from the rooftops about these activities or stories because of a fear of online backlash. Actually, where organisations did then use their platforms to amplify this great work that was going on, it could have a really vital impact because it offered a counter narrative to the far right kind of news pieces and posts that were landing on people's feeds through visible pictures or videos or articles that were highlighting and demonstrating that diverse communities could live well together. So we heard examples from things like asylum seeker volunteer groups through to heritage sort of inclusive history projects that were recognizing the role of South Asian and Commonwealth service people during the World Wars, for example, making Remembrance Day more inclusive. All of these efforts were creating a rich tapestry of amazing activities that were taking place, particularly at a kind of hyper-local neighbourhood and community level. And there could be a lot more potential power in amplifying this work online to, I suppose, disrupt and counter some of the more hateful, clickbaity news stories and some of the far-right propaganda that is spreading so rapidly and so virally through many communities. I'll briefly also run through some of the gaps and challenges that we found in stakeholder practice as well, particularly when it came to addressing community tensions that had surfaced over issues such as I say, asylum, but also international conflicts like Gaza. Most organisations in our research were struggling to engage the sections of the public that had more strongly held and polarised views to build opportunities, I suppose, for community dialogue and the sharing of different perspectives. So what we found across our work was a tendency for many community organisations to try and mobilise people who were perhaps already actively anti-racist, sort of already active allies on these themes. And there was less emphasis on trying to reach either the people on the middle who might be sitting on the fence on these issues, or to try and isolate and contain those people who were, the Tommy Robinson fans or the people likely to come out on the street. So we feel that it's important to try and preach beyond the converted, to reach and persuade those who might be vulnerable to prejudice and find interventions, spaces for dialogue, and spaces for kind of online or community-based campaigns that can reach those people with anxieties about our changing society to steer them back towards the mainstream majority. Libraries might actually have a powerful potential here as one of the shared spaces in our communities that are deeply respected across society and where people of all sorts of backgrounds come to access local resources and to be signposted towards support in their local authorities. And secondly, we felt there was a lot more scope for organisations doing work in communities to build better partnerships that could enable people of different backgrounds to meet and mix and to find that kind of social connection that I talked about on the previous slide. So there's tons of great work here being done often to support communities, particularly through the civil society sector. But what we did find is a lot of particularly sort of social opportunities, heritage or arts work, it can be very targeted and siloed. So there might be one activity one week that's targeting young people, perhaps more likely to be ethnic minority, and there might be another project that's taking place the next day that's sort of aimed more at an older and whiter audience. What we would quite like to see is opportunities for more partnerships that can bridge these different projects together, find shared stories or kind of shared activities that then do the bridging of creating intergenerational connections or cross-ethnic conversations where people can talk about both their unique lived experiences, but also the hobbies, the identities, the points of local pride that they hold in common. Thirdly, we feel that employers could also be playing a more active role in building cohesion in their communities. Workplaces are one of the most important spaces where, as a society, we're of course required to come together and work with people from across different backgrounds towards common goals and in a shared team. But we found only a small proportion of employers actually recognise how they can harness this to drive social impact on cohesion in their local area. So we feel it would be important to see more guidance and training from councils and maybe even funded by government on the role that employers can play to encourage social mixing within their diverse teams, to maybe encourage more volunteering among workers in their local areas, and to foster teamwork that can deepen bonds between people from different cultures and ages. And then lastly, in terms of some of the gaps in current stakeholder practice, we found that many organisations are just struggling to counter the rising issue of online hate. And I think this has become more apparent than ever over recent weeks with the kind of Unite the Kingdom campaign that we've seen in London, but also, nationwide online, and all of the misinformation and hate that has spread. Often far-right groups were able to sort of share this content in a way that became viral very, very quickly. Meanwhile, local councils or local civil society and community coalitions would respond very slowly with something like a kind of long and text-heavy open letter that just was struggling always to kind of receive the same level of viral popularity as the content that the far right was churning out. So what we want to try and see are more online campaigns and more kind of proactive online posts, stories, content that can do more of the resilience building and tell more of the positive stories, as I said on the previous slide, and put up a counter narrative to the far right in a way that can both challenge and stamp out racism where it rears its head in communities, but also tell stories about migrant contribution in communities and also draw attention to projects, moments, events where people are coming together, mixing and living well together with one another across all of their walks of life. So that draws to a close our kind of key research findings. I'll finish up with just a few reflections on what we think should be some of the priorities going forward for change. The Independent Commission on Community and Cohesion will be doing a lot of work in this space to come up with more concrete recommendations, and they're going to be actually launching a mass public and stakeholder engagement exercise to crowdsource ideas here. I will share the website and all of the information about this at the end of the presentation. But the authors of this report at British Future and our partner charity Belong came up just with a few kind of starting points, a few sort of starting reflections for the Commission to get their work going. So to finish up, I'll run through these. Firstly, we think it's really important to see sustained long-term national plans for cohesion, updated to reflect new challenges and opportunities in our society and backed by much more funding. What we're seeing is that Wales and I think Northern Ireland have national cohesion plans in place, and they've got kind of regional cohesion leads who make sure that local councils are delivering projects and that funding is being siphoned down to civil society groups to bring people of different backgrounds together. But we're lacking that in England and in Scotland. And actually, where it does exist in Wales and Northern Ireland, some of these cohesion strategies are a little bit outdated and don't reflect the changing kind of landscape of divisions and tensions in the UK. So we want to see a much clearer focus from national governments around the UK on preparing for unrest and looking proactively to foster cohesion so that riots don't take place and that we can have just a more thriving and positive kind of, I suppose, tapestry of communities. Secondly, we feel it's really important to get it right in our immigration and asylum policies in a way that both works for new arrivals and also the communities they join, through more conversations about how we can promote positive social integration and through also welcoming more constructive offline conversations about our immigration policy rather than these really nasty, bitter and kind of polarized online conversations. So that should include, for example, more things like citizens' assemblies or kind of local community dialogue spaces where people can have more constructive and also nuanced conversations about what immigration means to our society today, rather than the kind of clickbaity, divisive debates that are so often characterized online. Thirdly, online misinformation and hate are undermining cohesion, and there needs to be more effort to kind of keep pace with the spread of misinformation and to address the kind of impact it's having on our national politics. So, as I say, this has popular support based on our polling and our focus groups from the public across left and right, but it is going to take a bit of government confidence, I think, and a bit of nudging to get them to toughen up on some of the unchecked spread of hate on social media platforms, particularly the likes of X and Telegram. Fourthly, we want to see more investment, growth, and effective public services, as these all impact on people's views around cohesion, particularly where there's competition for resources or kind of growing economic pessimism, as I touched on at the beginning. And then lastly, there needs to be a real concerted effort to improve public trust and respect in politics. So ensuring that the tone and tenor of our political debate does not cross boundaries into prejudice, into stereotyping, and into kind of extreme dialogue, as sadly has become frequently more common across our different political parties. So those are our key reflections. We're hoping that they're going to be taken up by the commissioners in their work going forwards. I just want to finish on this last slide because this was also a really interesting finding from our opinion poll. But when we did throw this question out to the public on what they would prioritize in terms of developing closer communities where people can connect and interact better, the top choice by quite some distance, as you can see, was to invest more in shared spaces for people and communities to come together. Shared spaces including libraries, as well as leisure centres, parks and high streets. So very clearly, I think libraries have a role to play as sort of vital hubs in our communities. And I think the public, this came through very strongly in our focus groups as well, are well aware of how libraries are facing funding cuts, are often, providing holistic services, but on a shoestring budget. And there does seem to be a broad appetite to resource these spaces better and to provide kind of moments and opportunities for people to come together, form friendships, and ultimately realize that they have more in common than that which divides them. So on that note, I'll wrap up the presentation, but thanks for listening and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Jake. That was sort of wonderful and terrifying at the same time is sort of where I feel I am. Debbie, would you mind ending the recording for us, and then we can open up to the Q&A?